Okay, hey everybody, how you doing? I'm here today with this microdose with Dr. Alfie Bown. Alfie is a lecturer in digital media, culture and technology at Royal Holloway, and his research focuses on a lot of different things, including continental philosophy, media theory, and what interested me about his research was video games. Alfie is also a founder and an editor and a writer at Everyday Analysis, which is a pretty cool magazine where yours truly has published in the past. So if you get a chance, you should check it out. Okay. Thanks a lot for coming on here, Alfie.
Hi, Matt. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So I was just wondering a little bit, so what inspired you to look at video games? And can you tell us a little bit about what philosophical or theoretical interest they have to those of us on the left?
Yeah, great. I mean, for me, I guess I should start by saying that I'm a massive gamer and always have been. Since my 7th birthday, I think it was, I got my Sega Game Gear, which set me on the path to gaming, and I've been gaming sort of endlessly since then. I still play every day, and have no plans to stop. But it was actually Gamergate really in 2014, which because I had done a PhD in literary studies and in psychoanalysis, really, in critical theory, and gaming had always been a hobby rather than a area of study. But it was actually Gamergate which kind of happened in 2014. I'm sure most of your listeners know what it was, but a kind of series of harassment campaigns organised by members of the, let's say, 4chan right, which targeted various diversity figures who had entered the gaming industry, mostly women, and a few in particular, and basically made this claim that video games were becoming left-wing. And that this was a problem from their perspective, and so on. This was fascinating to me in a lot of ways. And I think that since that moment, really, the relationship between politics and games has been, palpably clear in the public eye. Whereas before that, there kind of existed the idea of games as escapism or not, or apolitical. But from Gamergate onwards into the Trump election, where you get a kind of emergence of gamer communities as a voter base and things like that. So clearly it became apparent that games and politics were much more deeply connected than one would have thought. And at that point, I decided to dedicate some time to study that process, the politics of games, really. And I think that they really can't be overstated how important games are in the kind of culture wars and in the relationship between the left and the right, and actually, perhaps most importantly, in the relationship between the left, right, and liberalism or capitalism.
Yeah, it's interesting because I remember back in, I guess, 2014, 2013, it was actually through Gamergate and a lot of the controversy around video game universes where I first learned about the alt-right and saw some of the kind of proto positions of the masculist movement, let's call it, becoming articulated. So just for those of our listeners who aren't really that familiar with the history, could you go into a little bit more detail about what this was all about and how maybe the kind of people who are angry about the rise of diversification in video games later on became more politically active?
You mean about Gamergate or just about politics and games in general?
Well, let's start by talking about Gamergate, kind of what happened there in a little bit more detail, just for those who aren't familiar with that, since it happened a little while ago, and then maybe talk a bit about how that transitioned into a more sustained political movement.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, I think it's really interesting, and I mean, the question of Gamergate is and its politics are actually quite complicated. I mean, so basically, it starts with this kind of indie game, Depression Quest, which came out in 2013, and then I think the designer of that's called Zoe Quinn, I believe, and then the initial term that was applied was Quinspiracy, which was basically a kind of misogynistic harassment campaign against Quinn, and basically the essential claim here was that she was just a target, really, rather of a wider point that that actually games shouldn't be political, that games should remain about skill, about play, but should stay away from political influence. And this is really fascinating to me, and the reason why I wanted to, and then of course it caught more steam when Anita Sarkeesian was the target, who had a big YouTube channel, and regularly her whole shtick at that time was pointing out, anti-feminist tropes in games and things like that. So
yeah, I remember Sargon of Akkad was obsessed with her for a little while.
Yeah, exactly. Well, but what interests me is less the misogyny. I mean, of course, these are concerns. I mean, of course, and I get your connection between the alt-right is very much there, and then there is a lot of prototyping of what we started to refer to as the alt-right in 2015, 16, and so on. There is a lot of prototyping for that in gamer communities, and things like grieving, which is the process, or salt mining, which is the process of going into a multiplayer online space and making people cry, and then screenshotting those evidence of those tears, which is the salt that's been mined, and posting that to image boards. This has a long history in gaming, and actually, you're absolutely right that the alt-right has its kind of the gaming community in some ways included incubators for these kind of alt-right online communities, which coalesced in the first Trump campaign. But for me, I mean, I don't think that gaming is right wing at all in general, or completely so. And the community is certainly very diverse. So I'm less interested in that particular aspect of it than I am in the assumption that games could potentially be apolitical. Because what struck me as fascinating here is that, why I thought, hang on, I have to say something in this debate, is that games have always been deeply political. And one can go right back to the beginning. The first ever games are stupid little things. I think the earliest sort of electronic game is this kind of cathode tube amusement ray thing, but it's basically like a shell heading towards you, and you have to kind of press the button at this exact time to block the shell. Soon after that, you start seeing, okay, there's early games which are sports. It's like Tennis for Two, coming out in the 50s and things like that, which I guess you could say, I mean, of course sport is not apolitical, but to a certain extent this is not the most politically important thing. But then soon after that, when you get into the 60s and you start seeing things like Space Invaders and Berserk, and in the 70s and things like that, it's clear that the games that are being produced in America are coming straight out of the context of the space race, anxieties, fears over Russia and its own development, comparisons between the West and the East. There is no game which is apolitical, and games never have been apolitical. You can even say that Sonic is Sonic's not actually, because I always get people saying, well, what about this? What about Sonic? It's completely innocent. It's not political. But, Sonic's a deeply political game if you think about how it represents. You start in Green Hill Zone and everything is kind of easy and, peaceful. And then you release these kind of bunnies and birds from a kind of technological prison, and Dr. Robotnik with his technology. And then as you move through the game, the artwork becomes more silver and less green, more dystopian. Sonic is an amazing political metaphor, not an innocent piece of fun. And this is why I thought this was a fascinating thing. And it's bizarre because actually people in the industry still insist that games are apolitical. In 2018, I want to say, or maybe 2019, The Division 2 came out from Ubisoft, and the CEO of Ubisoft was asked, oh my God, it's a dystopian Washington, it's about the decrepit old government and the need for renewal. It's a kind of critique of contemporary capitalism and what's happened in the Trump years. And the CEO of Ubisoft is sort of saying, no, this has nothing to do with politics at all. It's completely apolitical. This is just about imagining the city as a dystopian world. Of course, we can see that the motivation for saying these things is they don't want to alienate half their potential, sales.
Yeah, of course.
That they could target audience. But the point I'm making is, for a long time, there has been an assumption that games could be something away from politics, escapism, fun, play. And, play and fun and games are deeply political things and always have been. So what kind of seemed like was needed after Gamergate was less that games were becoming more political and this was being a problem, but that we were beginning to realize how deeply political games were, and that there's a lot of potential and I think quite an exciting possibilities for that, for the left as well as for the right, I think.
Okay. No, I definitely have a lot of questions, particularly about contemporary games, since I have some of my own thoughts on this. But before we get into that, I was just wondering, how much do you think this assumption, or really assertion, I should say, that games are just harmless fun, is derived from a kind of liberal ideological standpoint, which insists that we have a private sphere, that's a sphere of what we typically would call recreation, and that's apolitical or neutral, and shouldn't be interrogated, let alone through the lens of, say, critical theory, right? Or do you think that there's other factors at play?
No, absolutely. I think it's absolutely a liberal rhetoric, and I think that it's very important to think about this relationship between games and the right and the liberals, let's say, because this whole Gamergate thing was structured around a load of let's say misassumptions about what the relationship between the left and the right is, and it's not people's fault for making those assumptions. It's because our media has spent years and years presenting to us in this way, but games were not becoming more left wing. They were becoming more like liberal ideology, and so the right was describing these patterns as left wing, as they continue to do in politics today, when in fact what they are is liberal, and the left is accusing these things of being right-wing, when often what in fact they are is liberal. And so I think in some way this kind of situation with Gamergate, where the left is saying, oh my gosh, these games are fascist and violent and they're therefore right-wing, and then the right is saying, oh my god, these games have diversity and they're therefore left-wing. Both camps completely wrong in those arguments, and the fact was that games were completely and dominated by liberal ideology, a contemporary neoliberal ideas of capitalism and things like that. And of course that makes sense, because that's the context from which they emerged. So it made a lot of sense that both people on the left and the right were frustrated with something that was happening in the games industry. And also it's therefore precisely the situation we find ourselves in now politically, where I think people are starting to realize that in some cases there's more shared ground between the left and the right than there is, but insofar as they both have a massive problem with the kind of liberal status quo. I think that what kind of culture wars and debates play out in the gaming sphere around Gamergate and subsequently are also those which are kind of playing out in our wider political world. And of course, games as the number one entertainment industry now, bigger than the film, TV, music industries, of course they are the site at which the culture wars are going to be fought out. And I think you are seeing people across the political spectrum picking up games as not so much as a political tool. This is not about propaganda and convincing gamers to agree with you and making games that is going to convince a gamer to do what you want. I mean, nobody thinks that Corbin Run, the little Mario with a Corbin head game by a company called Games for the Many, is going to create a new wave of Corbyn voters, but at least the games are directly engaging with politics. And I think people are actually seeing that the culture wars are being fought out inside this space. Whereas, of course, the Liberals, as you pointed out in your question, the Liberals would rather it was seen as an apolitical space, because that way, these culture wars don't do the Liberals much good, to be honest, because they see the left and the right gaining ground. So they would rather it was seen as this kind of space of harmless fun, I suppose.
Well, just moving into that, just so we can ground this a little bit for those of our listeners who aren't like super big into critical theory, can you give me an example of a game that kind of embodies these tendencies? Maybe one that's reasonably well known.
Well, I mean, of course, all games. I don't want to make general assumptions about video games and say that one game embodies games in general, because, like films, you couldn't say that you couldn't give an example of a film which embodies films. But but what I can do is point out some examples where things are often not. They're often not as kind of diverse as they seem, and generally speaking, have kind of underpinned principles. So, examples I think are really interesting is things like one interesting example I like to give is the example of the kind of city building game Tropico. I find that very interesting because it's very much about sort of in some ways, let's say, a socialist or communist aesthetic. Like you can build an island, you can build your city on a kind of beach Cuba-like island and have a dictator with a nice little moustache and a red flag, and you can call your city a socialist one and so on. But in order to succeed in the game, you have to follow capitalist city building principles like those of SimCity or Civilization, and the only way to be rewarded on the level of gameplay and to actually succeed in the game is to follow a set of principles which are fundamentally capitalist and don't so it doesn't envisage any other way of organising or organising a city than a capitalist way, even if aesthetically it presents it in that way. And I think this is a pattern we do see. Another example would be the series Assassin's Creed. I think that they moved clearly from Assassin's Creed 3, at least. They started to move much more towards, let's say, wokeness. You get a much more diverse cast of playable characters, which is often mindlessly celebrated in the games industry. Although, of course, it's good to see that, but it's just quite gestural. and you also always in Assassin's Creed you always play as an oppressed class, attempting to rebel or fight back against some sort of central organizing force, which is hegemony and corporate or at least hegemonic and unfair governance. But at the actual level, that's all at the level of artwork, at the level of narrative, at the actual level of what you do in the game. It's not any different to any other open world simulator. Nothing has changed since Assassin's Creed 1, apart from the sort of shell in terms of what you actually do to play it. So what we're sort of seeing is games. I would say, to go back to the Gamergate argument, I would say that it did look like games were moving towards the sort of liberal at the level of story and artwork, but they didn't fundamentally change at the level of play. I think that's quite interesting in a sort of theory way. And what we're looking at is games making narrative gestures to be more woke and more diverse, things like that, which is like I say, it's a start. It's a start. But when you actually look at what you do in the game, it's absolutely none of that. So for example, another example would be Just Cause, where the whole point is to sort of destroy cities. It's this sort of like property destruction game. It's quite interesting to create a property destruction game, but it just does so in this completely mindless way, where like at the level of play it's exactly the same as like blowing something up in GTA or something like that. So what you see, I think, is certain sort of patterns emerging, and a lot of things that people are fighting over there are just the narrative, just the shell, we could say, of the game. So I think that for gamers, this is a big question. It's one that people are thinking about now, I think. How do we produce games which are actually different to play? What would a socialist game look like is a fascinating question, for example. Would it look like, would it just be a shell you put on top? There are some examples, such as Tonight We Riot, which is quite a good game, but it very much has gone for this kind of communist aesthetic and so on. Papers, Please, I guess, is one that gets mentioned a fair bit, an indie game from sort of 2015 or even earlier than that. And I think, there's movements towards this, but for a game to be left-wing, it doesn't just have to tell a story that's like left-wing. It has to be an experience of play and fundamentally different on the level of actually playing it. It has to have a different algorithms underneath it than the ones which reward the principles of the gaming industry up till now.
This actually leads me to a really interesting question about wokeness and woke capitalism, because as you mentioned, a lot of the culture wars are kind of fought over issues of diversification, which are fundamentally, I think, liberal ideas in some respect, right? The idea that we should be inclusive, tolerant, so on and so forth, without challenging structural economic foundations. And I'm wondering, to what extent do you see the rise of diversity rhetoric in the gaming industry as a positive development, and in what sense do you see it as in some ways insulating or even upholding certain variants of woke capitalism, which are fundamentally exploitative?
So I think that's a great way of putting the question, and of course it does. It relates to the way corporations get behind BLM and things like that, and we are obviously seeing a very central moment for woke capitalism today. And I suppose my more sort of official answer to that would be something like, well, it's just a tiny start in the gaming industry, because clearly, why not have a diverse range of characters? I'm not against it. I just think it's a tiny, tiny start, or maybe it's completely ineffectual. I don't think it's quite as Overwatch, I guess, is the big was the big game which was celebrated for this. Suddenly one could be represented across races, genders, intersectional characters, and you'd get to feel. But of course, it's so superficial, because at the level of gameplay, there's that much difference between Overwatch and Fortnite. You're not actually experiencing anything that's constructive to building a better society at all, and it's more about selling copies of the thing. So yes, I can even see the argument that this distracts, this kind of woke capitalism distracts from the fundamental economic issues that are at play here. And something I think is very important with gaming industry in this context is, and of course it's true of like Nike doing BLM as well, and this I'm taking from a friend of mine, Marianne Galvete, who's a fantastic critic of games, and she's always been pointing out that if you've got a feminist game, sure, it's got a strong female lead, and that feels great. But what if all the components that make the hardware that game is played on are exploited women working in Chinese factories who are underpaid and have no healthcare support and terrifying working conditions. How feminist can a game be if it's fundamentally based on the production of a completely capitalist and patriarchal system of exploitation? So, this is where I am with, of course, it's the same with Nike's trainers and the BLM side. There is a massive danger here that we're going to lose sight of the things that really need radically changing. And I think that this is another answer to the question you didn't even ask about what a left-wing game would look like, but one would need to build it on a different console for sure.
Oh, we're getting there.
and you would not need I personally think we don't need a PS5, for example. I don't want to play Grand Theft Auto 6. I'm bored of that. I would much rather we strip back to more affordable and more sustainable technologies, which we might be able to use to produce games which, sure, they might not look as graphically wonderful, but at least they wouldn't be fundamentally based on quite the same levels of exploitation that the AAA high-level gaming industry is today.
No, I think that's a great answer. Okay. One of the things I thought was interesting was starting in the 1990s, you saw a different kind of rhetoric surrounding game creators. I'm thinking of people here like Sid Meier or Peter Molyneux, who's the creator of Black and White and Fable, which was almost the same kind of rhetoric that you saw associated with somebody like Steve Jobs, where these game creators started to present themselves less as entertainers or the creators of entertainment and more like artists, right? But one of the interesting things that you saw associated with that is, of course, they weren't just artists per se. They were also capitalists, right? They were creating a product in the kind of way that you were talking about. And I have always had mixed feelings about this because on the one hand, I do think it's important to start treating games as a kind of artwork rather than just as a piece of entertainment, precisely because once you start thinking about them as works of art, they can become under scrutiny for all the different reasons that you're talking about. On the other hand, I really resist the idea of glamorizing the figures who create these as somehow just engaged in a purely creative act, dissociated from all the kind of productive problems that we're talking about, right? How are these games created? Are they created in a non-exploitive manner? And so on. So can you speak a little bit about this? And do you think that it's beneficial when game creators are seen as not just, kind of producers and capitalists, but as creators in some sense?
I think this is a really interesting question, and I do have an answer. But first, I just wanted to say that I don't know what this means, but it occurs to me to point out that way in which games get attributed to a kind of auteur figure. It seems to come from the board games and tabletop games communities,
really?
Where it's very conventional that even today, when a new board game is produced, it's very conventional that it has the name of the game's author, creator, right. Almost like an author of a novel. And then there's very much a culture of this person's games and that person. There's a kind of auteur creation of tabletop gaming, and that seems to, and that's come over to things like, as you say, Sid Meier's, things like that. Seems to be those games which have actually got a history in the tabletop strands of gaming as well, which is pretty interesting. However, I think that there's a massive difference between creating a tabletop game and creating a video game, and it's precisely because of how embedded it is with the industry and with capitalism. To a certain extent, if there's an indie creator who's made a game entirely on their own, to a certain extent, okay, one could see that point. But for me, I'm with you. For the most part, I'd rather we didn't think of games like this. And this is what I was trying to do in my book, really, to think about games. And this is why I chose, one of the reasons why I chose psychoanalysis as a way to think about games, because I think that games are a combination of things, and they are not. And I tried to playfully make this idea that we should use Freud's theories of dreams to understand games, because when you go into a game, you're kind of in a semi-conscious dreamlike state. But the problem is that, and of course, dreams are deeply political things. So the problem is that the game is not your dream, but it's also not the dream of its author. And this is where I'm coming to answer your question. It is not one person who sits down and imagines a world like Watch Dogs Legion. It is a dream or an experience of play, which is made by the culture around it. It's made by elements of capitalism. It's made by artists. Of course, the diverse range of people involved, from artists to designers to concept people, through to screenwriters, actors, and so on. But more importantly than that, it's a product of its kind of cultural moment. And this is, of course, you could say that about literature and you could say it about film, but I think with games even more so. These are collaborative symptoms of corporate capitalism, and it's view of its authors and its creators and its content producers. So yeah, I'm with you that it's much less useful to speak about games as being the output of one individual creator or author, because I think we should see them as cultural symptoms. Like if you play something like Watch Dogs Legion, which is just out, we're all responsible for the existence of something like Watch Dogs Legion, because it's a symptom of our society and our culture, and I think that's how I would think of them, and rather than as works of art produced by one or a few individuals, I guess.
Well, just to kind of push back a little bit on this question, around 2007 is the first moment. I should actually say maybe around 2001 when Peter Montaloni produced Black and White, but definitely around 2007 with the release of BioShock. That was around the first point where I noticed that games were overtly aspiring to produce something that had a certain level of thematic and artistic sophistication. And BioShock is famous for this, since it was kind of a critique of Randian capitalism, at least according to some individuals. And now you have games like Red Dead Redemption, which kind of aspire to the kind of pulpy grandeur that you would see in some of the old westerns, things like Unforgiven, or other Clint Eastwood classics like the spaghetti westerns and so on. Do you see this as a positive development, or is it problematic for a lot of the same reasons that you mentioned before? This aspiration to tell something, to say something important, or make a statement with a game.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's a very good question, Matt. And so with this reason, one of the reasons why I keep mentioning this new Watch Dogs game is because I've been playing it because I was asked to be in it. So I'm actually in there as a voice actor, I suppose, but basically having the same sort of conversation I'm having with you now. So what they did was they reached out to a load of sort of journalists and philosophers of games and got them to record podcasts, which you can listen to within the game in the kind of in-game radio. So like just like in GTA, when you're driving a car around, you can switch to the talk show station, and then you can hear me talking about this kind of crap. But this interests me because at first I sort of felt like, well, this is quite a good sign, and it's by Ubisoft too. I mentioned how that when the Division 2 came out, they kind of denied that it had anything to do with politics. So it seemed like there's been a little bit of a change here in the case study of one company like Ubisoft, where they've suddenly actually these games are part of politics, and therefore perhaps they could be making a political point. And let's directly politicize them by bringing politics and discussion of politics into the game itself. Okay, so when I first heard they were doing this, I thought, yeah, this is good, and I was obviously pleased just on a narcissistic level to be involved in a big game like that. But then I've been playing the game, which I don't like, and I think that no, I mean it has its merits, of course, but I think that it's a very bad case study for representations of rebellion in games. So it basically presents rebellion as and what's really nice about it for anyone who hasn't played is that there are no heroes. Essentially, the whole concept is that there's like 9 million playable characters. So every Londoner can be recruited, and so in some ways it's trying to go for this kind of grassroots, like, okay, anyone can be a revolutionary, and I like that. I think that there's some really things to its merit, and that's interesting. But at the same time, the way you sort of recruit people is basically you do them a favor and then they'll join the revolution. And it's just as easy to recruit a guard from this. I can't remember what they're called now. Albion, the absolute enemy guards that are the kind of tech Silicon Valley mercenary army that keep your city in check, as it is to recruit an anarchist, which is completely ridiculous. But also, it's basically gamifying revolution. It presents revolution as self-motivated and the result of carrying out a certain number of tasks correctly. And obviously, issues of gamification, there's a lot to say about it. But the point here is that games do depict revolution all the time. That's the in vogue thing. Right, from Ready Player One onwards, Just Cause, Watch Dogs Legion, Anarcute, where you basically play as these little cute rabbits that go on protests. But these depictions of revolution are they never depict organization. It's always just destruction, symbolic acts of destruction of a kind of centrist dystopian government. And they never build into their gameplay and structure anything like organizing, anything like ideology, like how would we actually go about getting a rebellion to happen. It's always just like, oh, just blow up this landmark, and then, you know, that gives you 5 points towards the revolution or whatever. You know, and there's so much creative potential in games. There's so much creative potential in games to think about new ways of organizing, right? New ways of structuring worlds, building things creatively, and that just never seems to be sort of taken up. So I suppose my sort of long-winded answer to your question is that, like, you know, it depends on every game, but for the most part, I think what we see is this kind of celebration of the aesthetics of revolution with no useful steps taken towards thinking about how to actually organize and create any kind of change. So I see it as really sort of almost fetishizing how revolution looks and how it's presented as this kind of wonderful, joyous experience, which is also fun because it's a game, but staying really stopping short of actually taking, you know, encouraging us to think creatively about different ways to organize.
Absolutely, and I think in that case, this shows the efficacy of the old culture industry thesis, pioneered by Adorno and Horkheimer, amongst others. And when they talked about how it is that the culture industry can assimilate revolutionary potential and commodify them, sometimes in surprisingly creative, though of course noxious ways. And, you know, a lot of people have talked about how it is that punk music or rap, you know, early 80s rap, early 90s rap, have fallen victim to this process of commodification by the culture industry. And it's probably not that surprising that revolutionary impetuses would be commodified in the same way by the video game industry. Moving on, I just had a question actually about kind of conservative approaches to games, because this is always where I become a little bit reticent about criticizing the video game industry too fiercely. And it's because I feel that sometimes there's a temptation sometimes to engage in kind of conservative elitism towards video games, which is essentially to kind of replicate this liberal gesture, but on steroids, by saying that video games are inherently a debased mass product. They can never have any kind of aesthetic interest in and of themselves, just because they don't rise to the level of something like high art, you know, the Tolstoys, Dostoevskys, or whatever it happens to be, right? And this has always struck me as a very kind of noxious, elitist, aesthetic gesture that I can't support, right? On the other hand, I am resistant to the idea that anything produced under current cultural and material conditions by the video game industry can genuinely express revolutionary thematic points in the way that you're talking about. So this kind of puts me personally in a bind when it comes to the interpretive framework I'm trying to apply to video games, because I don't want to move to elitism on the one hand or brand in my critical faculties on the other. So how is it that you think that we should approach kind of threading this needle, per se?
Yeah, no, I certainly see the point, and you know, I'm always quite careful, because I mean, what I do as well, I teach a degree in video game art and design at Royal Holloway, University London, and here I'm always very conscious of not coming across in any kind of form of elitist way to the students, and certainly not coming across, as I have done in the past, kind of accidentally, as somebody who thinks games are bad and we shouldn't play them because they're inherently doomed to do. You know, I don't think that at all, and I don't think that I don't even think that we shouldn't shoot people in the head with sniper rifles. I think that's fine. You know, and I think, you know, GTA, for example, can be, I mean, some aspects of GTA are horrible and you know, horrendously capitalist, I suppose. I'm not so bothered about the violence arguments myself, because they're not interesting to me. But some aspects of GTA are really interesting. I mean, like, if you think about it as an artistic representation of a city and how it writes class politics into its city, are actually fascinating. And there's some great art projects which have shown that. There's a fantastic artist, Alan Butler, who's an exhibition of just still screenshots from GTA 5, which frankly look like real photographs and make visible the class politics of a city, and it's fantastic. And this is within the very game which so easily and often gets dismissed as the most mindless and debased one. So I think that each game is quite diverse and has various aspects to it, and we shouldn't be, you know, we shouldn't dismiss them in that way. But to answer your question a bit more directly, you know, I don't think that. Well, I mean, I do think that, like, you know, the revolution can kind of come from within. You know, I don't think that we are going to, the AAA gaming industry is going to lead the way in ushering in a form of socialism. Absolutely, I don't. I think it's already too far gone. But video games are quite a diverse thing,
Right.
and the question of play, and like everything from the way we play our cities to the way we live has become increasingly gamified, and the kind of line between games and reality is sort of thinner than ever. So I think that games do represent a chance to think about different forms of social organisation. I mean, we can even think of gamified things like food waste applications where you get in-game rewards and things for, instead of spending money on food from Tesco or Sainsbury's, wherever your supermarkets you guys have over there, you get them from other people who are food that's going out of date and stuff, and then you get little points and rewards for that. It's gamification of the city in a way which is kind of, at least in some way, useful or environmentally useful at the very least. And then likewise in actual games that are more immersive, let's say, you can have at least attempts to imaginatively and creatively think about different ways in which society could be organised. And there's no reason why those would be, so when you think about the political potential of games, I don't think we don't need to go all the way to saying that, like, games are gonna, big Hollywood games are obviously not gonna usher in a new form of social life any more than big Hollywood films were likely to do. But at the same time, there are so many different ways to use gaming and the technologies of gaming to experiment with what socialism could do with technology going forward, and how enjoyment, how pleasure, how play could be part of a society that was organised differently. I think games and gaming would very much need to be part of those discussions.
Well, actually, this is a great segue to the next question I had, which is there are some conservative Marxists, and they do exist, I know, who have interpreted the formation of gaming communities, as they called, including gaming communities in virtual way, as merely a sign of people's alienated subjectivity under neoliberal capitalism, right? And oddly enough, some of these kind of conservative Marxists almost adopt a reactionary line where they say, well, the reason people are entering into these gaming communities is because they're alienated by the conditions that they live in. They're not so-called real communities, right? And therefore, they can't really have any kind of tremendous social meaning in the lives of the people that make them up. And I've always been resistant to that, right? On the other hand, it's hard to figure out where exactly gaming communities, or what exactly gaming communities are, and what kind of sense of meaning and solidarity they provide for the people who participate in these communities. And some people are very invested in them, right? So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. And secondly, can you talk a little bit about how it is that, I suppose, reactionary gaming communities emerge, some of which have a very bad reputation. I'm thinking of, for instance, the StarCraft community from back in like the early 2010s, was very criticized for being highly exclusionary, elitist, very bro-dominated, and so on. And I say that since I was a member for a little while.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I think this is really important, and it goes back to what we've sort of touched upon earlier on in our chat about how I think what happened with when I say that gaming communities were sort of suddenly people realised they were there when they all came out to support Trump, and suddenly there was this almost untapped voter base, and that tapped into what you were saying about, okay, people are there in gaming communities because they're alienated, and but this is I think this is something to drop entirely, really, and the idea. And for me, this is why games are so important, and it's another of the reasons why I decided to, start writing and dedicating my career really to thinking about games. Is that games are no longer a subcultural thing. Mm-hmm. So I'm less interested in games as subculture, and I know there's a long history of that. And I've heard from and discussed some really interesting people. I was recently interviewing a former Street Fighter esports champion who's transgender and felt the opposite of this idea of gaming communities. That the one that I put this question to her that you put to me. I said, aren't these like the most misogynistic right wing communities that you can find often? And she said that her experience of life in the arcades in the 90s was the only aspect of her social life where she didn't feel she was judged and that she was accepted precisely because she was good at Street Fighter and nothing else. So there was a certain kind of diversity in those communities that was interesting for her. So I think that's interesting. So I think that one of these communities are probably not as characterized by Pepe the Frog as we might think, and because that's the ones that get the attention. But my main point is that gaming shouldn't be thought in this way anymore. More than 50% of the world are gamers, and that goes through to Africa and everything, and countries where they've not long had high quality internet. rural China. African gaming's grown massively, and there's a massive move towards a gender balance now as well, although of course certain games are still played by men more than women, but generally speaking it's about 50-50 across the board. And so what basically looking at is a whole generation of gamers. So and games are essential part of how we all grow up, and this is where also in a different conversation, I'd say more about psychoanalysis and how we need to think about subjectivity, and a little bit more maybe something like cybernetics theory and plasticity, Catherine Malibu's idea of plasticity and how our brains are changing. And the next generation, my daughter's 4.5, she plays video games very, very well. Clearly, this kind of plastic brain idea applies here, and that you're becoming a different group, different subject. The gamer is no longer a niche identity on the forums in the basement of their mum's house. The gamer is a description of what it means to be basically a subject in 2021, and increasingly so for the future. It will be something inherently connected to everyone's subjectivity. And, even if you don't play video games, which is basically no one, you do. It does affect you. Your life is gamified. You use apps which have features of the video games industry in them. You use, various products, and your whole city is affected by games. Architects are using them to build your buildings. Doctors are using them to train their staff. Games are everywhere. And so I think it's in some ways useless to think about gamer communities. Of course, there are millions of different types of those with millions of different politics. But generally, I think we need to think about games as something which is the mainstream now, and having a mainstream impact on how people think and feel. And if you think, as we have kind of intimated, that for the most part, liberalism and capitalism are the discourses which are winning out in this massively influential, transformative genre of media, then clearly the left would need to get itself involved in those processes to make sure that something as massively influential as games doesn't just transform us into increasingly capitalist subjects.
No, I think that's very well said. And I imagine that there's partly a generational factor at work here, not to give into kind of cheesy generational politics, right? But somebody's pointed out to me that, as the boomers kind of age out, that means that, Gen X, millennials, and Zoomers, every single one of them have grown up in an environment where games were widely accepted to be part of the popular culture, right, and people's everyday lives. So I think that's quite significant. But moving on to my last question, this is kind of a cheesy one, but I think it is important to ask. Whenever I bring up these kind of cultural criticisms of well-known pop culture products, right, whether movies or games, popular books, at least a few of my students or people I'm talking to kind of react viscerally to it by being like, look, why do you have to ruin everything? You know what I mean? I just want to go home from my work, from work, sit down with my video games, play them, and not have to think about something. And now you're telling me that these are interpolated in all kinds of systems of exploitation, and we have to start considering things like gender and racial differentiation amongst characters and so on. I just don't want to have to deal with that crap. And I think that we all feel that way sometimes, right? I'm a fan, for example, of the Marvel movies because I grew up reading comic books, I like comic books, and I kind of get a thrill from seeing them on screen. I'm very well aware of their inclusion within a massively exploitative Hollywood system that tends to perpetuate certain ideological tropes that deny our capacity to think revolutionarily about the social conditions that we live in. So how would you respond to people who kind of just push back a bit about this that way, right? That, look, why do you have to be a pain? Can't you just let me enjoy this, uninhibitedly?
Yeah, well, let me answer it from the perspective of a gamer instead of a theorist or a journalist or whatever. I've been playing games, as I said, since I was 7, which I guess I'm 33 now, so it's a fair chunk of time. I do play indie games, but also big mainstream games, and always have throughout that whole short history, I guess. And I can say this: I'm bored of the games themselves. And I don't think I'm on my own. When it's a new Assassin's Creed, or even when it's something that's not that's not been out before, like this new Cyberpunk game, or it's a new Civilization, or so. These are classic games. These are great games. They were incredibly fun in their time, but I think that we're actually getting quite bored of, and any gamer knows that across such a range of games, there's certain things that just get inherited and move from one to the other, and it's actually quite rare now that you find a game which is quite new and quite and generating a kind of fun that's interesting enough to sort of keep you going. And you can put they sort of seem to be designed. You can put hours and hours into something like Assassin's Creed, but you're just going through the same process you've been through again and again and again. And I think that thinking politically about play and realizing how political play is going to and is already producing much more diverse and fun games. So I get the point that one doesn't want to always think about it, but come on, it's not difficult once you put your headset on or put your controller on. It's not difficult to forget, right? You can still have a conversation about the economic patterns that the industry is implicated in, and then still get into the immersion of the game and just enjoy it for what it is, right? But I think by actually being politically critical of games and their underlying structures, we're going to see more fun, not less.
Okay, I think that's a great answer. Well, thanks a lot, Alfie, for coming on. This was a lot of fun and a really interesting conversation for a Sunday afternoon. Is there anything you'd like to close on? We always like to give our guests the last word if possible.
No, it's been really nice to come on. If listeners want to check out our new project, it's called The Popular Show. They can find it. It's a kind of show. We talk about woke capitalism. It's basically a bunch of lefties who are looking to work out the relationship between liberalism and the right. We get some really weird, controversial guests on. And we should have you on as well sometime, Matt. We've only been doing it about 3 or 4 weeks. We've only had 3 episodes. You can find us on YouTube and at The Popular Show, and check it out. And you should come on and join us for a chat one day, Matt.
I'd love to. Okay, well, thanks a lot, Alfie, and we hope all you're doing well. Stay safe in these fucked up times, and yeah, this is Matt from the Pill Pod.
It's been really fun. Cheers, Matt.
Cheers.